Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have with us Joshua Spatha. He's an author, minister, and we'll learn from him about ancient wisdom and spiritual clarity that can address the modern crisis of meaning. With deep insights into history, worldview, and faith, he challenges secular assumptions and outlines a path to personal and societal removal. We'll learn a lot about all these things, and he will also learn about unseen forces that guide our lives. Welcome to the show, Joshua.
Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. Welcome to the show. Welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk right now. We'll talk about spirituality. We'll talk about cultural collapse. We'll talk about rediscovering the sacred. But before that, let's learn a bit about your background, your journey, Joshua, so that the audience knows who they are listening to.
I grew up in the U.S., grew up in Kansas, and had barely left my state for most of my life, but was always interested in things, engineering, design, math, science, and so ended up in university studying anthropology, and then also picked up a minor in geology. I really had a curiosity of what not only what human history was, but kind of the bigger history. How did we get here? Why are we here? And the scientific questions did not satisfy. There's three elements or aspects of reality. You know, there's the spiritual world, the abstract world, and the physical world. And science can address some of the questions in the physical world, but it really has no ability to address questions in either the abstract world or the spiritual world. So philosophy and theology, why, the bigger questions. Science can deal a little bit with the what, and sometimes the how, but it really doesn't offer any significant answers in terms of the why. And humanity across the board, I've traveled to many nations, India including. I've been there 4 or 5 times. And regardless of our sociological background, regardless of what culture or history we come from, what is universal across the board is that humanity deeply wants to understand the why. Why are we here? What meaning do our lives have? And what meaning can our lives have through our actions and how we live? And so we have to go beyond the physical realm and into the abstract world and into the spiritual world to really grapple with any of those questions in any meaningful level. And so after my coursework and degree in the scientific field, I was actually planning to go on to seminary. That door shut, and very surprisingly to me, I ended up in missions and have traveled around the world since then for the last 20 years. And my cultural anthropological, background, maybe played into that a little bit in terms of being able to look at, appreciate, evaluate different cultures and different worldviews. But really, it was a big surprise to me. But it's been a whirlwind of a ride for the last 20 years.
Absolutely, and a lot of wisdom that you gain from that, and maybe that's why you are. But I want to understand for the common person, if they were to understand, what is Joshua Spatha trying to do? What is he trying to achieve with whatever he is doing?
Yeah. Well, again, different societies, different civilizations are going to be at kind of different phases of civilization. But in the West, America, Europe, we are really at a critical moment in our civilizational life cycle, if you will. Originally based on a Judeo-Christian worldview, and then recently in the Enlightenment, there were a lot of questions that came up in terms of spirituality and philosophy and science. But increasingly, post-Enlightenment, Western civilization has really myopically focused on the questions of science and the physical world. So much so that spirituality has kind of been pushed to the side, and in many circles, including in academia, even openly ridiculed and mocked. And therefore, there is a hole in our worldview. There are certain questions that we have deemed not even worthy of asking and not possible of finding answers to. And that has created quite a crisis in Western civilization, because humanity is inherently wired for meaning. We want there to be meaning to life. We want to have meaningful relationships. We want to engage in that world. And when we have a worldview which tells us that we can't, then there is a disconnect and a frustration that builds up that eventually leads to crisis. If I were to tell you that feeling that you have that's called hunger, I'm sorry, there's no answer to that. There's no such thing as food. Like, that would be a very frustrating situation for you, because you have the feeling, and that craving should lead you to then go grab a sandwich, and satisfy that hunger. Same thing with thirst, same thing with love. Like, it doesn't make any sense that humanity has an innate desire to love and to be loved if there's no such thing as love, and we can't have meaningful relationships. And so I think it's telling that there is an innate desire, a hunger, a spiritual hunger that is pre-programmed, if you will, wired into humanity, that we are born with it. It is not something that is taught. It is not something that is learned. It is not something that's inculcated by the culture. This is something we are born with. It is deeply innate. And there's books on this from a medical and biological perspective that even make that case, that we are hardwired. Our brains are hardwired to believe in something greater than ourselves, in a greater spiritual reality that came before the physical reality. And our deep desire is to connect with that, so that we understand why we are here, not just how or what, right? And so in Western civilization, we are really at this place of such a critical moment in history, that by rejecting spiritual truths and spiritual realities and myopically only focusing on the physical, there is a great frustration and tension that has built up in our society and in our worldview that we're going to have to resolve one way or another. And if you look at the cycles of history, that typically is not resolved in a very positive way. It typically leads to civilizational collapse and war and death and famine and chaos. And that is not the reality that I hope we choose and move towards. So this book and my study for it was really focused on what's the alternative? How can we actually reconnect with our spiritual heritage and that acknowledgement of that reality in a healthy, productive way that avoids catastrophe.
Absolutely, absolutely, Joshua. We'll come to the book. Let us understand this a bit. Is it because, was it because that it just happened? Or was it because there were forces, industry forces, which wanted people to think only about industrialization, 9-to-5 job, produce, and then just don't let them think, and it will all end up in their being more powerful. And that is where everything else became powerful, but not the mind and spirituality. Do you think it was like that, or it just happened? Because why I ask this is that if it was like that, then do you think those forces have weakened? If not, then where is the recourse? Help us understand this part.
Okay. Yeah. I think there's not a simplistic answer, and I don't think it's an either or paradigm. I think it's a both and. Certainly, just on the normal everyday level of your average human being who is going to work, raising a family, paying bills, there's certainly a tendency to focus on your immediate surroundings and on the immediate needs, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You're going to focus on food and water and shelter before you're ever going to ponder greater truths and realities of the universe. Nobody is interested in peering into outer space through telescopes and wondering if there's life on other planets, for example, if they're starving, So there's a baseline level of needs that have to be met physically for people before they have the time, energy, or bandwidth and capacity to think about bigger questions outside of just their own survival. And so I think certainly in the Industrial Revolution, there were those internal pressures that I'm just going to focus on my own sustenance. I'm going to focus on my own wealth and health and prosperity, taking care of me, myself, and I, and my family, So there's certainly that aspect at play. At the same time, there's also external pressures, cultural pressures, where we have determined culturally what we believe to be true about the universe around us. And then we begin as a culture to reinforce those narratives and to promote that version of truth. And so the culture around us is certainly going to be shouting at us, telling us what we should believe, how we should behave, how we should interact with our fellow man, et cetera, et cetera. But then to your point, I do believe that there's also, again, then a spiritual element and a spiritual world that also has an effect on the physical and on the abstract world where math and thought, exist. And so I think all three of those spheres or elements of reality have an impact on our daily lives. And so I wouldn't say it's one or the other. I would say it's a confluence of all of those influences have probably led us to where we're at. Your question about has that changed or has that pressure externally decreased or changed? I don't think so. I think due to the nature of man, history has shown over and over and over again that when we kind of commit to a decision, even when it doesn't turn out the way we thought, and even when it's actually quite detrimental, we have a tendency to double down on stupid and continue very belligerently down the path that we have chosen. If you're a parent, you know this very well with children, right? Especially young children. And so I think there is that natural tendency for us to just be very obstinate, and we double down on the decisions that we've made, and that can exponentially increase, the timeline of when kind of the consequences then occur, as well as escalate the intensity of those consequences.
Absolutely. So, see, there was a poem, the East is East and West is West and never the twain shall meet. Is it the time that, the West has to understand the East much, much better, and the East also has to understand the West better? That is the way it has to all move forward. Or can the West, or will the West look at moving forward with spirituality in its own way? Where is the thing that you are seeing? And you can quote from the book also, though I would separately also come to the book, Mere Spirituality, a Rational Embrace of the Supernatural in the Crisis of Our Age.
Yeah, well, I won't quote from the book. I'll quote from better authors and other figures. But in terms of coming to a middle ground, that was really part of the intent of the book, is recognizing that each camp has some valid arguments, right? That their perspective is not 100% wrong. It's also not 100% right. If you look at, again, if you take those three elements, looking at the spiritual world, the abstract world, and the physical world, different worldviews and different cultures will place a stronger emphasis on one of those three. In the West right now, we're placing a very strong emphasis on the physical world, almost to the exclusion of the other two. Although, math and science, abstract concepts, we still adhere to, but philosophy has kind of grown out of favor, and theology has largely been dismissed in the popular realm. However, on the other side of the spectrum, you have worldviews in the East, such as Buddhism, which goes to the other extreme and focuses so intently on the spiritual world that it almost dismisses the physical world. And so again, I think there's this balance that needs to be had. We have a tendency, due to our personalities and our cultures, to gravitate to one side or the other, because that's just the easiest response, is to like finding that middle balance. You're on a knife edge. It's just so much easier to slip to one side or the other. And so I do think that there is a balance that needs to be found. And, in your East versus West paradigm there, I do think that there is a balance and lessons that each culture can learn from the other. The question, will that happen? I am not super hopeful. It's not that I'm not an optimist at heart, but just studying history and the patterns of how this has typically worked out in the past doesn't leave a whole lot of room for optimism for me, unfortunately. But I do agree with you that we need to come together, learn to listen to the other side, and have conversations and dialogues and discussions on to understand the perspective of someone who puts the emphasis on a different one of those three categories, and see the wisdom in that. And if you're a businessman or a leader of any kind, you have to acknowledge your weaknesses. Like, none of us are perfectly rounded individuals who have mastered every aspect of life. And so as a leader, it's really important that you first recognize your weaknesses and shortcomings. And then number two, staff them. You need to surround yourself with other people who have a different gift set or a different talent or different expertise in order to round out, that business plan or that leadership structure. And I think the same goes with cultures and societies and civilizations. We each have a tendency to specialize in a certain area, or have a greater gift set in a certain area. And then we kind of establish our identity on that thing, and therefore kind of dismiss and even mock the others. Because again, human pride comes in, and we want to be right, and we want to be the best. And so it just leans into our identity, and we have a tendency to reject other opinions, other worldviews, other perspectives other than our own. So I'm 100% with you. We need to have those conversations, and both sides need to be ready to listen and hash out where is truth, because it's probably somewhere closer to the middle than the fringe edge that I'm standing on.
Right. And maybe we can look at it that is there actually a East versus West? I think it's East and West. It's just that, the sun shines differently at both the sides, but it's the same sun. And it's about and, not versus. And people have to take the best. You see, a lot of people still from the East look at it at the West as the Big Apple. You want to go to the US, the American dream always lured. So that part of its industrialization and all, that is also a desire of human beings. And a lot of
For
people
sure.
from the West have been coming to the East, not only India, China, so many other places, and have been taking their own ways of understanding things. It's been since many, many years we know about such stories. I want to understand that along with that, this understanding is growing. Secondly, earlier science used to be, almost captured by some of the people that it cannot move along with the spirituality. Whereas in many people used to think about beyond science answering some questions, there were other questions to be answered, which can be only answered through spirituality and all. Do you think now science and spirituality, the time is right, they are walking much more closely together, and it is time that in future it will walk almost hand in hand? Is that the way you see it all happening, Joshua? So that then I'll come to the book.
Yeah, I think that there will be a subset of the population that pursues that. I don't think that will be the majority. I wish it would be the majority, but again, history just doesn't favor that view. Again, human pride, arrogance, and obstinance just kind of gets in the way time and time and time again. And so I agree with you with your kind of overview there of the West has kind of, as a result of them really focusing on the material world, on the physical world, economic development was a consequence of that. And that is a good thing. Just a couple hundred years ago, 94% of the human population on planet Earth lived in poverty. And as a result of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism and economic development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we've seen that number plummet, to where we are currently living on the richest, most wealthiest, season in all of world history, with the lowest number of those in poverty ever. So I think, we can champion those successes, but on the flip side of that myopic focus on the material world has again caused some gaping holes in other areas of our life. And for example, I've traveled a lot, and I'll give you some anecdotal evidence, but the actual studies, bear this out as well. But if I talk to an average person in the US, and as you said, very economically developed, even our most poor people in the US are probably some of the richest people globally. And so there is definitely still a disparity there. But when I talk to your average American citizen, they are blessed, economically beyond what anyone in history could have imagined, beyond their wildest dreams. And yet they are not happy. They are not content. They are not joyful. They are not grateful. Why is this? Because this insane focus on material wealth and prosperity has created a discontentment in them to where they are always jealous or envious or wanting something more. They're looking to someone else who has more than they do, and therefore they are not content. They are not happy. They are not satisfied. Contrast that, I go to the East, or just about anywhere, really, and if you are working with any people who are truly living in poverty, it's shocking how happy they are. Like, they are some of the most joyful and content people on planet Earth. They have virtually nothing, but their hospitality is some of the best that you will ever encounter. Their joy is some of the highest that you will encounter. And it's very shaming, honestly. I've taken Westerners overseas on trips many times. And this is a universal response, is that people who would get outside the American bubble and see how the rest of the world, particularly in areas of poverty, how they live, and they're shocked and they're humbled because they realize money does not buy happiness. And so there is a spiritual component. There is a meaning hole in that myopic materialistic worldview, that it doesn't matter how much money we try to stuff into that hole, it does not satisfy, it does not fulfill, because there is meaning beyond what we can accumulate in terms of physical resources and materialistic gain. And we're never going to get beyond that if we don't start asking those questions philosophically, theologically. What is the meaning of life? How can I live a meaningful life? And again, that's anecdotal evidence from just my own personal travels, but the studies bear this out over and over and over and over again. Any survey results that you find from secular or religious sources are going to show that this idea that money can buy happiness is not at all true. There is a much deeper intrinsic need that humans have for meaning that the material world simply cannot provide.
Absolutely. And that brings me to your book, Mere Spirituality, Rational Embrace of the Supernatural. So what is mere spirituality? And what have you discussed in this book? Who is this book?
Yeah, well, the first few chapters of the book really just kind of assess the problem. Where are we at in Western civilization? How did we get here? And what has been the consequence of that? And so that kind of sets it up to hopefully alert people, because again, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a lot of people are fairly oblivious. They might feel something, but they, to use a Matrix line, there's a splinter in your mind, you can't quite put your finger on it. You don't know what it is, but something is off. And so the first few chapters of the book really focuses on, hey, here's where we got off. And then the remainder of the book then shifts gears into solutions. How can we recover what was lost? And so that really delves into spiritual disciplines, ancient spiritual practices. How do we reconnect with the divine? And of course, different cultures and different societies are going to have a different definition of what the divine is, what that spiritual reality entails. And so, full disclosure, this book is definitely written from a Judeo-Christian worldview. So it doesn't cover just spirituality, from a generic, all-encompassing view. It also drills down into the Judeo-Christian worldview of what spirituality is and how we can engage with that. But despite that, of course, across the board, there are many religious practices which overlap and share commonality. So many religious practices are going to incorporate things like prayer and meditation, offering or some sort of giving of yourself either to God or to others, right? So a sense of generosity, and reconnecting with that, and then living out that faith in your moral life, how you interact with others, and regardless of the worldview or the religious practice that you may adhere to, again, there's going to be some commonalities there. I'm not aware, maybe you are, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of any religious practice, for example, that states that you should do it all by yourself. Like across the board, there is this sense of community within humankind. that we need each other, that we need meaningful relationships, or we need outside help, a mentor or someone to help guide us along that path. This is intrinsic biologically when we think of, parents and children, and even grandparents. It's important that we connect with the older generation and gain and glean from their experience and their wisdom. And so I think there's definitely some commonalities across the board religiously, but of course there's also points of theology and spiritual practices which are in direct contrast and will separate practitioners out according to their worldview and belief system. But I think at the core of the question, step one has to be a recognition that the spiritual world is part of our reality. And if we just, from the outset, if we reject that, then we are setting ourselves up for failure. We are setting ourselves up for a meaning crisis because it rejects a truth that is universally held, not in just the current human population, but of every population, of every culture, society, and civilization that has ever walked the face of the earth. There's been this understanding that something had to come before this. Even in scientific terms, there is the reality of gravity. But the reason I know that is because Sir Isaac Newton, classic example, the apple fell from the tree, right? He saw the effect, and that was an effect in the physical world, but it actually communicated a truth in the abstract world. It communicated the higher truth of gravity. Now, we don't fully understand gravity. We have theories about what it is and how it operates, but we universally acknowledge that gravity exists in some way, shape, or form. We see the effect of that in the physical world, and so we know that there is a greater truth in the abstract world that is causing that effect. In the same way, the entire physical world and the entire mental world or abstract world also has to have a cause. It has to point to a higher truth or a reality. And regardless of how you conceptualize that in your worldview, ultimately that is going to have to come down to a spiritual world or a spiritual truth, because what came before space, time, and matter, by definition, has to be spaceless, immaterial, and timeless. And so the only way that we can really wrap our heads around that truth is, well, it can't be something of the physical world. It can't be something of the abstract world. Those both have to be products of something greater, of something that was eternal. And regardless of your framework and the nuance and the semantics of how you might conceptualize or phrase that, that's going to be the spiritual world or a spiritual reality.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's much to learn about all these things from you, Joshua, and I'm sure a lot of people would want to connect with you, learn more about these things, and also learn from your book. What is the best way for them to do so?
Best way would be my website is www.m, as in mother, perspective.org.
Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thanks for having me.